On April 12th, 1776, we had the first verified official action by one of the colonies calling for independence from Great Britain. It happened in North Carolina with the passage of what's now known as the Halifax Resolves. I've got an interesting and quick history lesson on that one today. But first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. I'm Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the Fast Friday edition of the show for April 12th, 2024. And to kick this off, we have to do just a little bit of background and start it out with something called the North Carolina Provincial Congress. This is a very revolutionary move at the time, and Wikipedia describes it as extra-legal unicameral legislative bodies formed in 1774 through 1776 by the people of the province of North Carolina, independent of British colonial government. So what they were doing is they were forming their own representative or legislative bodies, despite the fact that, well, the parliament said, you really can't do this. This was very revolutionary at the time. And eventually, sooner or later, when you're taking on the empire, you got to start organizing whether they approve of it or not. And that's what they were showing us here. And if you think about the timing of this as well, we saw a lot of this popping up around the colonies throughout 1774. There was a lot of action in response to the coercive acts, which came in as a response to the Boston Tea Party, which came in as a response to the Tea Act. We can keep going back and back and back, Townsend Acts, etc. But things like the Halifax, or not the Halifax, the Suffolk Resolves, which called for non-compliance to the coercive acts, disobedience to courts, tax resistance. We also had the Continental Association and the Declaration of Resolves of the First Continental Congress in 1774, non-importation agreements, and the like. But anyways, there were 5 of them from 74 through 76 in North Carolina. They met in the towns of New Bern, the first and second, Hillsborough, number 3, and Halifax was the 4th and 5th. Now, I think the third one they're all very important, but later in 1775, we have the third one. And this is where you really see kind of a ramping up, especially later in the year after Lexington and Concord had kicked off in April of that year, where they were really prepping for a military response. And the Congress then divided the state or the colony into 6 military districts for the purposes of organizing militia and for determining representation on a new provincial council. These districts included Edenton, Halifax, Hillsborough, New Bern, Salisbury, and Wilmington. Now, shortly after this, we have actually in February of 1776, I think it was the 27th, this is the first battle in the War for Independence in North Carolina. It's actually a very important one, but it's not discussed real often. We often think just Lexington and Concord, and then everything just went to town at that point. But this was a battle that happened at Moores Creek Bridge. And in some accounts, you could say it was pretty small. And I've seen various numbers, but I think the most accurate ones was about 1,000 on the Patriot side versus 800 on the British side. They didn't get the reinforcements on the British side like they were hoping for, and I think they were outsmarted a bit, and it was a pretty quick victory for the North Carolina Minutemen and the North Carolina militia. Here from NCpedia, they describe it like this: called the Lexington and Concord of the South. It's kind of a big deal. The Battle of Moores Creek Bridge was significant for several reasons. First of all, it marked the permanent end of royal authority in North Carolina. I mean, by the time this had already happened, they were already organizing their own system without British approval, but this really hammered it home. It also prevented the British from seizing control of the South at the onset of the war. And it was also a very primary motivation for the next provincial Congress, which started very shortly after in April of 1776. And here's how Kelly Slapey at North Carolina History puts it. The Patriot victory was fresh on the minds of the members of the 4th Provincial Congress when they reconvened on April 4th, 1776 in Halifax. Independence seemed imminent. Colonel Robert Howe remarked to the assembly, quote, "Independence seems to be the word. I know of not one dissenting voice." And here from historic sites in North Carolina, Samuel Johnston of Edenton, president of the Congress, wrote soon after his arrival in Halifax that, quote, "All our people are up for independence." It was almost unanimous, probably. Well, I mean, we know they passed the Halifax Resolves, which I'm getting to here in a moment, unanimously. A committee of 7 began investigating, quote, the usurpations and violences by Great Britain against America. That is a very interesting term because this is very similar to what was used in the Declaration of Independence as well. So there is some influence there potentially. We always call them a list of grievances, but it really is a list of injuries and usurpations. Usurpation being an exercise of power not authorized to government, a theft of power. St. George Tucker later called usurpations acts outside the Constitution as treason against the sovereignty or final authority of the people. If you think about what was going on, this radical change in the viewpoints of the people during the Revolution, before the shots were fired at Lexington and Concord and also at Moores Creek Bridge, for example, the radical change was an understanding that all power flows from the people and government is really just an agent of them. We shouldn't be surprised that when Parliament heard things like that, there was going to be a conflict. But when you're thinking about government doing things that they're not supposed to do, committing treason by usurpations, that's a pretty big deal. So they go through listing they're concerned about dealing with all these usurpations and violences. And that was also a very similar phrase used in the Declaration of Independence. Now back to Kelly. Within a few days, the Provincial Congress created a committee to explore further measures that should be taken to defend the colony, as well as preserve the state of the colony. There was Cornelius Harnett, Alan Jones, Thomas Burke, and Abner Nash. They were all appointed as acting members on this committee, and it met on April 8th. I'm going to link to these articles plus the original source documents, like, for example, the Journal of the Proceedings of the Provincial Congress of North Carolina held at Halifax on the 4th day of April, 1776. I mean, it's modern print-ish, but you certainly can go through the minutes of all these meetings day by day by day. Here on April 9th, 1776, the Congress resolved itself into a committee of the whole to take into consideration the present state of the province and the expediency of employing a military force for its defense against foreign and domestic invaders. If you're thinking about defending the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic, that's the type of that comes from the mentality of the American Revolution. Because if you're on the right side, bad guys can be bad guys, whether they seem to be your neighbor or they're coming from a foreign country. Those invaders of your liberty, invaders of your property, invaders of your rights, they can be foreign or domestic. So that's what they were doing. They're discussing these types of things. And then on the 12th, that select committee that started on the 8th, they met for a few days. They came back and said, and it says this in the notes, the select committee, taking into consideration the usurpations and violences attempted and committed by the King and Parliament of Great Britain against America, and the further measures to be taken for frustrating the same. So their goal is they're doing stuff that they're not supposed to do, and we are going to take measures to frustrate them. And it may have to require a military response. Now, mind you, of course, until they were attacked, it didn't require that. They were doing things like non-importation, non-compliance, and things like that. But the goal was to frustrate these usurpations and violences. And that's how we have to deal with usurpations of power. Even Alexander Hamilton in Federalist number 33, talking about the Supremacy Clause, he said, if they're not acting in pursuance of the delegated powers of the Constitution, these are merely acts of usurpation and deserve to be treated as such. And to me, that's such a powerful statement, even though I am a Hamilton hater, and it even says it in my X profile that is on my profile there. This is absolutely correct. And you can see the mentality of the American Revolution in that statement. Everyone understood what that meant. When they usurp power, you don't just comply with it and then wait for them to decide that they made a mistake. No, you have to take actions and measures to frustrate their efforts. Anyways, again, back to the full text of those minutes of the Provincial Congress. They say, pursuant to the plan concerted by this is the report from the committee, pursuant to the plan concerted by the British Ministry for subjugating America, the King and Parliament of Great Britain have usurped a power over the persons and properties of the people, unlimited and uncontrolled. uncontrolled. This, like so many other documents of the time, whether it is a Declaration Resolves of the First Continental Congress, or was John Hancock's great oration against his Massacre Day oration, or later in 1776, Thomas Paine's American Crisis #1, they all recognize that the source of the conflict, Alexander Hamilton in 1774, in December of 1774, mocked the idea that they were going to fight or taking a stand. The controversy with Great Britain was over a mere 3p tax. The underlying principle was the Declaratory Act, which claimed unlimited power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever. And that is really what they're getting at here in the Halifax Resolves as well. So they're pointing out, like, look, they're claiming unlimited power, unlimited and uncontrolled power. Anyways, the British fleets and armies, they write, have been and still are daily employed in destroying the people and committing the most horrid devastations on the country. Now, they also did complain. I skipped over it. If you're looking up on the screen here, I skipped over some of my highlights, but they did also complain, very unfortunately, but it's a fact of history, about British governors encouraging slaves to fight with the British to get their freedom or to kill their masters. Anyone who had blood on their hands would be seen as good by the British. And even on May 8th, let me pull this one up. This was right near the end of this Fourth Provincial Congress. They actually passed a resolution with this statement. It is expedient to recommend it to all masters and owners of slaves on the south side of Cape Fear River to remove such male slaves as are capable of bearing arms or otherwise assisting the enemy into the country, remote from the sea, and that the commanding officer on that station be empowered to remove all such slaves as are above described to such distance as he shall think safe. So they were concerned that the British were putting the word out there that, well, if you can bear arms, fight against these guys and we will set you free. Now, mind you, the British weren't the good guys on this either. They were just opportunists. And Adam Zielinski over at American Battlefield Trust actually, I think, really sums it up well. He writes, "We must caution, though, that these calls by the British were not done because they were abolitionists on a moral crusade. Not even close. The British were attempting to disrupt the continental unity at any cost. And it also must be noted that in many ways, the British took advantage of the American slave system for their own benefit. By promising freedom, the British would potentially benefit in the short term by gaining thousands of laborers, carpenters, cooks, and scouts who could assist the army. And in fact, they turned a blind eye and actually helped implement the whole system all along, and they only cared about it. They only cared about the freedom of these people when they could be used as a tool to fight their enemies. So I don't want anyone to start thinking that the British were somehow great on this at all. So I just wanted to kind of point out that type of history because most people skip over that. And I think it's an important thing to actually remind what was going on all around. Anyways, back to the minutes. They say the moderation hitherto manifested by the United Colonies and their sincere desire to be reconciled to the mother country on constitutional principles. Remember, James Otis Jr. in 1761, in his great speech against the writs of assistance, said an act against the Constitution is void. And when we point that out, so many people will tell us, well, what do you mean? The Constitution didn't even exist yet. But they were under what was known as an unwritten British Constitution, and they still had rules that they had to follow, and they wanted to be back in. They made many efforts to peacefully resolve the issues on constitutional principles. You do not have the right to tax us internally, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts, the Tea Act. You do not have the power over us in all cases whatsoever. You do not have the power to establish and keep a standing army. Well, you have the power through force, but under the constitutional authority, you don't. And when they go beyond that, well, then you're not bound to obey them. That's what we heard from people like Patrick Henry. We heard from Joseph Warren, from John Adams, and so many others. So they talk about how we went through moderation. We've tried to go back to peacefully on constitutional principles, but they have procured no mitigation of the aforesaid wrongs and usurpations, and no hopes remain of obtaining redress by those means alone which have been hitherto tried. Your committee are of the opinion that the House should enter into the following resolve. So this is what they recommended. Resolved that the delegates for this colony in the Continental Congress be empowered to concur with the delegates of the other colonies in declaring independency. and forming foreign alliances, reserving to this colony the sole and exclusive right of forming a constitution and laws for this colony, and of appointing delegates from time to time under the direction of a general representation thereof to meet the delegates of the other colonies for such purposes as shall be hereafter pointed out. So in other words, they're saying we're authorizing you to vote for, not propose, but vote for independence with the other colonies, form foreign alliances, and create our own constitution. And here from Jason Mandrish over at Founder of the Day, he points out that this was the first instance of a rebel government officially admitting reconciliation was no longer an option. It wasn't even on the table anymore for them in Halifax at that point. And although the North Carolina delegation had been informed that they were to support independence, well, they were specifically told not to motion for a vote. I mean, they didn't put it in those words, but they said you are authorized to vote with others on independence. And although he said this may seem strange, it was a very calculated move. And this was for a reason, because all the delegates in Congress, unlike what we have today, took their responsibility to represent their colonies, their states, very seriously. And if you think about the representation in the Continental Congress, that's very similar to how the structure was originally supposed to be under the Constitution, representing the states, reporting back to the states, following some instructions potentially. If a motion was made to declare independence, everyone else at that time probably would have said no. So North Carolina received updated instructions. The other colonies had not. But really, what we're talking about is the first domino, making it official that they wanted out. They wanted independence. They were going to create their own constitution. And the rest of these other colonies started to fall. The dominoes started to fall pretty quickly. And from my understanding, every year on April 12th in North Carolina, there's something called a Halifax Day celebration. If any of you are out there, I'd love to hear a little bit about that. If you've actually gone to one of these events, if they're telling a good story or if they're distorting it, but there's plaques and markers. It's held in the Halifax Historic District. Sometimes they do some reenactments, etc. So it's a pretty big deal. And today, the date of April 12th, 1776 is actually right there on the North Carolina state flag. This is a very important thing that most people don't even know about. First in freedom, April 12th, 1776. There's also another date, May 20th, 1775. This also recognizes something called the Mecklenburg County Declaration of Independence. There is some historical debate over whether or not it was official or real, because it was never really published until years and years later. I think it was like 1818 or something like that. Thomas Jefferson didn't think it was the real deal. John Adams did it first, and then he agreed with Jefferson. But it's on the flag. It's kind of a big deal in North Carolina, and I think we have to recognize that one as well. It's an episode that I want to spend some time on to cover Mecklenburg as well, but it wasn't for the whole colony. So let's say Mecklenburg Declaration is 100% factual. It absolutely happened. This was a county specifically saying we are declaring independent. So I think that's very interesting to point out as an aside as well. Now, on April 13th, the day after the Halifax Resolves passed, the delegates then formed a committee to start working on a constitution. And here from All Things Liberty, they put it this way. The renowned Halifax Resolves firmly announced that in addition to directing its delegates to vote for independence, North Carolina was, quote, resolving to this colony the sole and exclusive right of forming a constitution and the laws for this colony. It's hard to be more independent than saying, well, we are totally disregarding you guys. We're authorizing our people to vote for independence if we can get some unanimous support from the other colonies, or if we can get support from the other colonies. But in the meantime, we are going to create our own constitution, our own government. We don't care. They may say they still have power, but we're creating our own. And so they started working on that almost immediately, and it was ratified by the 5th Provincial Congress in December of 1776. Well, anyways, I hope you guys found this to be an interesting and quick historical lessons, maybe something we didn't learn about in government-run school. I never learned about almost anything that I cover here on this show. But if you want to help us get this kind of information, these foundational historical lessons out to more and more people. There's nothing that helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. You can join us for as little as $2 a month. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, I hope you enjoyed the episode. I hope you learned something. More important than anything, that's what we're looking for here. I hope you have an awesome weekend, and I hope to see you next week here on the Path to Liberty.